Hello, friends, and a warm welcome to the Slow Living Collective podcast. This is a podcast about slowing down, simplifying your life, living seasonally, and embracing an intentional life. I'm Amy, a 30-something mum of two, homemaker, home educator, and allotment gardener. These episodes are my journal, sharing what's on my mind and sometimes sharing the things I need to hear myself as well. In these episodes, I delve into what it means to walk a different path in life, to step outside of societal norms and embrace all the beauty that it provides. From educating our children outside of the school system, living with less, and surrounding ourselves with a life of purpose instead of living a life by default. I welcome you into my world, a place where you can rest, relax, and slow down. Come on this journey with me as we open our hearts and minds to a different way of living. I hope you find what you're looking for within the words of these episodes and that they speak to you in your own unique way. Hello everyone and welcome back to this week's episode. I am so excited for this one as today's guest is someone who I followed for the longest time on Instagram. You might know her, but if you don't, by the end of this episode I know you will want to head over and find out more about her. Today we're going to be talking to Billy from Each Mindful Day. Billy is a teacher in her day job and a breathwork coach and mindfulness guide in her other job. Today we're going to be talking about seasonal living and in particular we're going to discuss winter itself. But we're also going to be talking about the theory of wintering in our lives and why Billy is so passionate about breathwork. I know you're going to love it. So without further ado, let's dive into Wintering with Billy. So, hi Billy, welcome to the Slow Living Collective podcast and thank you so much for joining me here. Before we get into today's episode, do you want to introduce yourself to everyone? Tell us who you are, what you're about, what it is you do, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for having me. My name's Billy. I am a secondary English teacher, but also more recently a breathwork coach. So that's something that I'm going to delve into quite a bit today. I live in Essex. I've got 2 young children and a husband, and I enjoy living seasonally. Also have an allotment plot like yourself. Yeah, and just, I love your page, resonate with so much you put on there and think we probably have quite a bit in common, but also areas where we're quite different as well. So
yeah, and it's really interesting actually because we, like as you were saying that, we are very similar. I mean, actually, we don't live that far from each other at all. So after this podcast, we should arrange to get together for a coffee as
yeah,
well.
that'd be lovely.
But yeah, like you say, there are things that when I'm like viewing your page as well, like things that we are the same, things that we are different. And that's what I think, just makes like, a good conversation because we're not all the same. And I think we should like celebrate the unique parts of us.
Absolutely.
So today we're going to delve into wintering, both in ways to tackle the season of winter itself, but also how we embrace like difficult times in our life as well, which can also be, considered and named as wintering as well. Those low seasons of life, difficult times in our own life cycles, where we feel like we're at the winter of our lives. And so let's start with, what does wintering mean for you?
Okay, so for me, it's really about leaning in and surrendering in times when rest and retreat are most needed. And personally, I have actually consciously made a decision to do that within the season of winter over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I would think, but also very mindful of there are natural ebbs and flows in your lifetime where some of the tips or some of the sort of routines that fit into your sort of winter season along with nature, you can also use at any time within your life where you may be feeling that pull. So, currently reserving energy for the emergence of spring, but that's something that may happen and does happen throughout your life. We're often programmed to think that from birth you sort of power through your life, gaining more knowledge, being more successful, and then sort of surrendering towards the end of your life. Very linear, but that's in truth that's not how we are made to develop at all.
Yeah, I love that. I would say I have been sort of more aware of seasonal living for probably less time than you. I definitely, I don't know if you're the same, like now I know more about it. I'm like, oh, So obvious, like it's so obvious the way we feel, particularly around the seasons. And I was actually recording a podcast yesterday that I'm going to put up, and it might already be up by the time I put this up, but I was talking about how, like, around New Year, and around the emergence of the new year, we're sort of like encouraged, aren't we, to just be like, be on, be ready, like hit the ground running, New Year's resolutions, set your goals, set your intentions. And it's such a time where you're just like, no, I don't feel that way. I just, it doesn't line up with anything sort of, in relation to the moon, to the sun, to anything in the calendar. It's like somebody was just like, plop, here is this date, that's when the year's going to turn over. And I was actually reading something, because while I was recording the podcast, I was like, why is it in the end of December to the beginning of January? Like, why is that the moment that the year turns over? And actually said, like, up until the 18th century, the new year was actually celebrated in, like, Great Britain, except Scotland, in spring, in like the 25th of March. And so it's like, well, that makes so much more sense. Like, that's when I feel like I'm sort of coming out of winter, and sort of like I feel that promise of what's to come.
Absolutely. I feel like, similar to yourself, it was only sort of when I started delving in and reading things that I was like, oh, that's it. That's what I felt in particular times, and absolutely through January, February. And then I'm so sick of talking about lockdown, but actually that was where I learned so much. And I just finished a creative writing for mindfulness course in the January. So I really felt like I was settling in for my winter around that time. And then, of course, we went into lockdown. And I'm pretty sure you've read this book anyway, but this was one of the first books I read in lockdown, The Wintering by Catherine May. And it was just, it just spoke to me, particularly at that time as well, because it was, really difficult at the start of lockdown, coming to terms with everything. But it was just the most perfect read, and it continues to be the most perfect read. I've read it each year afterwards. So I think it's now more people are sort of understanding what that term means. So it's kind of getting a bit more widespread. I wouldn't say to a massive degree, because I know a lot of sort of friends and family that I speak to, they're like, what? But let's talk about our weight goals for the new, like that kind of thing. And I finally stepped away from that. I mean, that was kind of the last thing to go. But yeah, sort of now living that and accepting and understanding it is kind of, it's really eye-opening, actually. It's something so small, but it changes quite a lot.
Yeah, I agree. And when you mentioned lockdown as well, like, I'm the same. It's like, sometimes I think, like, haven't actually processed the trauma that was 2020. Like, I'm like, oh gosh, that was a year. But at the same time, I'm very grateful for what I sort of discovered during that year, because, like you said, it was so difficult at the beginning, but then I actually sort of, it encouraged me to slow down. I think it encouraged a lot of people to slow down, because like, life was simply like, how am I going to get my shopping? Like, I can't see anyone, I can't go anywhere. How can I exist within my four walls? And the news was, doom, wasn't it? It was like, I was terrible at doom scrolling through the early part of the pandemic, like checking the BBC news all the time, like, and when you're hearing like X amount of people have died every day, like, it has an impact on you. And at a certain point I had to say, like, enough's enough. I cannot continue to absorb all of this information, because it is a lot. And I know when sort of, coming out of the pandemic, or coming out of lockdowns at least, that I was also pregnant through one of the lockdowns, the last lockdown. And coming out of that, you know, I realized that I didn't want to go back to normal. Like, you know, a lot of sort of like in the media was about like, you know, getting back to normal. And it's like, I don't want to go back to that. I don't want to go back to, I feel like life has now been divided for those of us probably who are adults during the pandemic. Life has very much been divided like pre-COVID, post-COVID. Like, and and that's how I often, like, if I'm talking about it, I often refer to it like before COVID. It's like, you know, it's I just didn't want to go back to sort of like that way of living, like, you know, the rat race.
Absolutely. I had the exact same conversation this morning with my Pilates instructor, actually. And we said our bodies aren't designed to live the way we currently live, or that society tells us to live, 100 miles an hour per day. And I'm guilty of being a very busy person. But come this time of year, I like my sort of social life or whatever I'm doing to kind of reflect the bare bones of winter. So minimal plans, to be honest. I'm this January, I feel like I've saved loads of money because I've barely done anything. But I've really spent time at home, like with the family, making a setting somewhere that we all like to relax and whatnot. So yeah, it has made such a difference to our lives, and hopefully in turn my children's lives too.
Yeah, I find the same, like, you know, just passing on some of these sort of newly discovered skills, I guess. And it's funny to refer to them as newly discovered because actually, like, this is traditionally how we used to live, but we've completely lost it. And it's almost like, oh yeah, like this is how, like, I think I've seen you read this book as well. You know, The Body Keeps the Score.
Oh yeah.
And I was thinking about that in terms of, and I know that's, you know, that's about trauma and trauma response, but I was thinking about how, you know, how we can apply that to the seasons and living seasonally as well. Like, our bodies know. Our bodies know, and our minds just haven't caught back up to it yet. Like, my body knew my whole life that I feel like this sort of rebirth and renewal in the spring. And I always like refer to it as like, oh, I can feel it. I can feel the promise of spring and summer, like it's coming. And it's like, because that was naturally when we celebrated the new beginning. And we know these things, but we just don't know that we know them. It's kind of
That's
like
right.
that that I don't know if you watch Friends, but it's like they don't know we know that we know.
That's what I heard in my head.
So yeah, it's just that, you know, we are a bit sort of disconnected now in the modern world from where we were, I guess. And I actually think that this year I've actually been seeing more and more of people actually saying like, actually, January doesn't feel right for me to be starting something new, so I'm not going to do it. And I think, you know, we're probably similar ages. You know, we've actually grown up with this like new year, new me mentality, and almost feel like, okay, what am I going to do in the new year? And it's like, actually, nothing. I'm gonna, I'm just gonna, you
I'm
know,
okay with quietly planning, pottering away, retreating in that, and then sort of like with the emergence of spring, you put those plans in action.
yes.
Yeah, so it's like resting, thinking about your intentions and whatnot, but not necessarily seeing them through yet.
Yeah, and I think as well, like I actually started you know, learning some stuff like at the back end of last year. So it's like when you want to do something, you don't have to wait for this moment of January. It can
Yeah.
come whenever you're ready to start. Have you checked out the Slow Living Collective on Instagram yet? We share more than just these episodes there. Whether it's slowing down, simplifying, coaching, mindfulness, meditation, yoga, or holistic coaching, there is something there for everyone. So head over to @the Slow Living Collective and get ready to be inspired and encouraged. From that, how do you embrace winter and protect like your mental health through a time that can be a bit dull, can be a bit dismal?
So lots of reading, writing, journaling, and of course breathing, but also things like taking time with the family and planning out what we're eating in terms of nourishment. obviously winter's a time for bugs and viruses and stuff, and obviously I'm not qualified in that area, but I know from when things lead to like antibiotics, for example, and thinking about gut health and that not being so great on that, you then need to be thinking about what you're putting into your gut to protect your mental health, and winter is massive for that. Luckily with having the plot, we've got lots of freezers and freezer space, so it's a time for getting out all of the sorting out what we want to cook with the gluts that we had from summer and autumn and the preserves and stuff. So yeah, it's a time for sort of clearing out and feeding ourselves up too.
Yeah, I'm the same as you. We've got we invested in a chest freezer last year, and we only live in a really small house, so we were like, how can we get a chest freezer that fits in our space? So we was able to get like one of those quite narrow ones, but it's amazing. I'm always like on a freezer dive, like just see my legs flapping at the top. But yeah, I mean, that's the same, just the things that we grow on the plot, and I want to increase that this year as well. So just thinking about what we're putting into our bodies, and the germs of the season. We have suffered our fair share of germs this year because my daughter started nursery, and that was what comes with that, lots of germs. And so yeah, we've just been surviving, and sometimes that's what winter is, just surviving. But you mentioned earlier as well that you're a breathwork coach. So what passion projects within that are you working on right now?
So in terms of really my intention with being a breathwork coach is getting the awareness out there, empowering people with all the techniques that you can use for so many different aspects of your life, whether you're feeling anxious, you want to sleep more, you want clarity in your life. There's something there for you to be able to move through that. And thinking about breath awareness or conscious breathing, it's essential for us to learn to flow back and forth between the two of those. So when you're with breath awareness, the breath breathes you. With conscious breathing, you breathe the breath. So really, in terms of my role in sort of getting the word out there, this week, for example, I put my first track on Insight Timer, and that was massive for me because I'm such a dinosaur with technology, but I wanted something, free content for people to be able to access whenever they so desire. So that was something that had been burning up for a while, and now I know what I'm doing. I can add to that. But I've got quite a lot going on, but the one that I always come back to is my seasonal sessions. So, obviously including coming up next week, I've got my winter session. So including some sort of mindful winter activities and suggestions and things to grow and what's in season, etc. Along with some creative writing around that as well. I always find really nourishing and love to plan.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. And I know at the end of this episode, we'll tell people where they can find you and where they can connect with you. But it's funny you mentioned Insight Timer, because I signed up to Insight Timer this week as well.
Oh, cool.
So, I mean, we do some of the things we do are similar, some of the things we do are different. So I just qualified as a yoga teacher. And so, breath work is, the absolute core and foundation of everything. And I want to delve into I've got more courses that I want to take for my so I've got more that I want to do for my continuing development. I have to do some kind of like continuing professional development is just part of sort of like that yearly go around the sun when it comes to yoga practice. But yeah, so I completely understands and appreciate how important breath work is, and I love following you on Instagram and learning more, especially because I want to learn more about that, more than just sort of like the basics that I have learned while I've been studying yoga. So what inspired you to start practicing breath work, and then inspired you to obviously move on to be a breathwork coach?
Okay, so again, it was coming back to like lockdown, finding it really hard to switch off. Like yourself, I was in a state of shutdown. I was just sat on the sofa, refreshing that BBC News app. You know, and I often come to times like this, when you see war on TV or whatnot, I just shut down, and just nothing seemed to work. I felt like I was doing all of the things, like you know, I enjoy yoga, Pilates, walking, horse riding. Oh, I've got a million hobbies, but nothing was switching off my mind. And I realized it was all sort of physical energy that I was releasing, which was kind of in turn feeding into my burnout as well, but not releasing like any stored emotional energy. So when I first came across breathwork by chance on an app during that period, so wow, this is finally my mind seems to be switching off, and it's sort of a bit of a wow moment, really. And then I went through a period where it was this time last year, really. My youngest was starting school in the September, and through no sort of pressure around me, but I know people started asking questions about whether I was going to go back to work full time. And had I not already had sort of musings in my head about wanting to do more, you know, that may have upset me, may have led me to make other decisions, but I didn't. And just by chance, I sort of won a discounted Reiki session and thought, oh, what's all that about? I'll go and try that out. And was told that basically all of my chakras were blocked, and there was obviously something that was going on inside me that were basically, my values were misaligned, and I know that that was linked to my current work and my other, you know, my other role. But at the same time, I then had this calling, because I was following this wonderful breathwork instructor, and did an online session with her, and I just felt really compelled to join her training. And I felt so far out of my comfort zone. You know, I've taught for 14 years and done nothing else. I've never worked for myself, or, you know, had to set up a business. It was all just so scary for me. But she gave me the confidence to make me believe that I could do that. And I've always just felt so inspired and pulled by tons of other people within the wellness space, like my Pilates instructor. My yoga instructor is wonderful as well. But never believed that I had a space there, or I had a right to be there, really, because, you know, I'm in such an institution that's so far removed from anything like that. But I took the plunge and went for it. And like I tell so many people, it has literally changed my life, because it's not just the breathing, it's not just the techniques that I'm using on myself, which again is backed by science. It's something we've been using for thousands of years. I'm using it to remove so much energy from myself and keep my anxiety at bay. But teaching it and finding that wow moment from other people as well is just incredible. I'm really, really love it. I'm quite new to it, but what I've done so far in the last 6 months since qualifying is just incredible.
I love that. And honestly, I love when I follow you as well. Like, you know, when I see that your classes are like filling up, like, I love that. And, you know, you should be really proud of yourself, because it's not easy to start your own business. I've worked for myself for 16 years, and it's not easy to start up and even know what you're doing, you know. And, you know, the other night I was cracking out a tax return, like all of these things that have to go on behind the scenes, like, you know, it's not easy. So, you know, you should be proud of yourself. And I also know what you mean about feeling like I'm not qualified to exist in this space as well. I think we often have imposter syndrome over that, but, you know, and sometimes we just have to like step out there and be like, okay, actually, going back to Insight Timer, one of the things I applied for was to host live yoga sessions. And it's like, can I even do that? Like, am I good enough? And so, you know, those things, you know, come up. So I think it is difficult, you know, when you start out on your own. But it's, you know, there are some really rewarding parts to it, you know, not doing the tax return, but But there are really rewarding parts
Yeah.
as well. And like you say, seeing how breath work impacts other people and seeing how it helps them like it helped you is really great. So listeners might be wondering, like, how do you balance life and work? Obviously you said that you have like a teaching role, and you also obviously now teaching breath work as well. And so how do you balance life and work, embrace the needs of the seasons, and take care of yourself? Because I think, as well, just living in the modern world, but being women and mothers in the modern world, like, there's so much that we feel like we're supposed to do. How do you balance all of those things?
I think for me, because I'm quite lucky working, I have been working part-time for the last 8 years now. I've had that time whilst raising children, just kind of embed some of those routines and rituals and whatnot. And now my children are getting a bit older. It's more about including them in all of the above, everything we've been speaking about. My son has asked me to do a breathwork session tonight, for example. So really inviting them to slow down in moments that you need to, or they're down the allotment with myself. I run it with my mum. I know, like yourself, couldn't do it on my own. It's such a big job, but getting them involved makes it just so much worthwhile. It doesn't feel like you're leaving them out, or you've got to find childcare or something. Living within that together, showing them the importance of self-care. So afternoon baths when they're coming from school, putting pajamas on in the winter, feel rested. My daughter loves a foot spa. Even things like making our own hot chocolate and going for a walk in the forest, things like that. I know you enjoy that too, but that's all self-care, and that's all nourishing my soul, and in turn it's nourishing them as well. So if we're including them together, I don't need to make extra time. But a lot of what I do is when they're asleep anyway. But it can be a hard job marrying everything up, especially with children. But you have to make it work for your family and how that looks like in your own home.
Yeah, we do the same as well. I try and get my daughter to do yoga with me, and she loves it, although she likes to do Cosmic Kids yoga. And so I got her to do yoga with me, and she was like, I don't want to do this boring yoga. Because I was just doing a class from the yoga school that I qualified with, and to her, she likes to see like the cartoon backgrounds and be going on an adventure. But she was like, this is boring yoga, this is boring mummy yoga. Yeah, we just it was important, like when you were saying, like including them in everything, because as well, I often think when I'm including the children, whether it be in yoga, whether I want to encourage sort of meditations and mindfulness with them. My children are still very tiny, but just want it to be sort of like a natural way of life, so that they're not like 37 years old and like, oh yeah, that makes sense, why have we not been doing that my whole life? Because we're being pulled further and further away from it, and I would like to take them back to where we were. I know that breath work is crucial practice, but I want to know, what do people misunderstand most about breath work and what you do?
Well, mainly I get well, what is that? Or you think, well, it's just breathing. What could there possibly be to teach others or make a business out of that seems a bit crazy. Like I've already mentioned, breathing practices are thousands of years old, but thankfully science is now catching up with that to support it. And there does seem to be a movement towards understanding more about breathwork, but we're trying to create the ripple effect. People seem to misunderstand sort of the enormity or lengths that this modality can take you. So it's not just about releasing emotions, helping you sleep, also increase clarity and anxiety. Yes, the sessions, if you go to a group session, can be fun and informative, but if you use this as part of your daily practice within yourself, the benefits of that are just humongous. I was reading actually earlier this book I've got, Breath by James Nestor, and it's quite, the lungs themselves will lose about 12% of capacity from the age of 30 to 50 and will continue declining even faster as we get older, with women faring far worse than men. If we make it to 80, we'll be able to take in 30% less air than we did in our 20s. We're forced to breathe faster and harder, and this breathing habit leads to chronic problems like high blood pressure, immune disorders, and anxiety. So even the science is telling us that we need to be doing something about the automatic system that we have within our body that we can actually control. We breathe 6 to 10 million times a year, so that's a lot of time that we could actually be using wisely in order to learn a lot about ourselves. So sometimes we can control the breath because that's what's necessary for us, and sometimes the call is to surrender, just like the way we're living our life, with feeding into our actual theme of wintering here. But you know, we can use the breath consciously, or just use it to slow down and just be aware of it, to clear the thoughts in our head, and control our mind, body, and emotions. So I think there is so much that we can say about breath work that people just don't understand yet. I hope it's yet.
Yeah, and I think it is going to become sort of more and more prevalent, because, you know, just over Christmas in my house, my mum and my husband were talking about something, and then mum started talking about breath work, and my husband's like, what's that? And, you know, so, you know, and the next day she came round and she had a book in her hand and was like, there, read that. So, you know, I think it is going to become more known, and I hope it, you know, I really do hope it is, because like you say, it's, you know, we do it all the time, right? We're breathing all the time. Just think how many times we've taken breaths throughout this episode. And, you know, there are ways that we can sort of, you know, like you say, surrender to it, but also, you know, actually be aware of it. And I think it's, yeah, I'm excited to see sort of how it progresses. And like you say as well, you know, science is catching up with these things. It's like, you know, with our minds, I remember reading about like neuroplasticity and, you know, being able to form new neural pathways in our brains, you know, years ago. And, you know, I think that's, you know, coming more to the fore now. And I know, like, when you've got children and stuff, like when they're little, it's like everything you do is you're forming a new neural pathway, and it's like no pressure. You know, I can't do anything wrong because it will be a bad one. But, you know, we know that actually these things aren't set in stone, and that we can actually, you know, make a positive change. And when we understand them, you know, we can make those changes. So yeah. So what inspires you to do what you do?
Well, number one being my breathwork instructor, because she's absolutely incredible and so supportive. And then the network of trainees that I had on our course as well, just incredible. When I always say, when we were at the live training, it was, oh my goodness, I'm going to do this, this, and this. We're going to take over the world. And then when we came back to our own communities, and everyone was a bit like, well, what's that? And we were like, oh, maybe we're not. But teaming up together, we're creating that ripple effect and seeing what they're doing in their communities, and then looking at what I can do in mine, really inspires me to keep going. Obviously knowing that there is such a need for people to slow down, take a moment to reflect on themselves and think about their mental health, is enough to inspire me to keep going. My initial sort of pull to do something like this was the need for it in schools for both students and staff alike. So I'm really hoping that by this time next year I will have found a way to make that happen. Obviously I know with schools and budget and money and whatnot, but even doing something to a small degree in schools would be incredible.
That would be wonderful. I think as well, like, you know, you know that I'm going to home educate my children, but you know, I'm very passionate about, you know, the way school is, because although, you know, I have the privilege of, you know, being able to home educate my children, and that's what feels right for our family. On the flip side, like, school is absolutely the right place for many children, and to be able to like arm them with some of these crucial skills would be incredible. And I know some schools are sort of moving more towards like mindfulness and more time outside, forest schools in sort of like primary education as well. So even the nursery that I sent my daughter to, she spent like all her time outside. How she got colds, I don't know. But yeah, so I know, some of these things that we know promote, just positive well-being, being outside and, understanding our minds and our emotions and stuff. I think they're so important for our children. And, I always, even though I'm going to home educate, I'm still a big proponent of school being the right place for a lot of children and a lot of parents to put their children as well. So they can coexist, certainly can coexist together. So Billy, it's been absolutely wonderful to have you on the podcast and share with us your passion for seasonal living, breathwork, etc. Where can listeners connect with you online? Where can they find out what you do? Where can they listen to your wonderful voice about doing breathwork? Tell us everything.
Okay, so I'm on Instagram at Each Mindful Day with a full stop in between each word. And I'm also on Insight Timer as Billy Smith as well. So yeah, or you can email me at billy@eachmindfulday.com. My messages are always open for anybody that wants to talk about breathwork in particular, because I absolutely love it.
I love that. And when you find something that you really love, like, I think you can't help talking about it, but then people actually, they understand like how passionate you are about it. Like I always think, like, when I'm on Instagram, like, I always say this to my husband, like, I don't show up by accident. Like, I always come with something to say, usually quite long as well. Like, I spent the last 15 years of my career being a writer, so it's like my Instagram captions are an extension of all the words that rumble around in my brain. But I think people can tell, when you're passionate about your subject. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I know it can be a little nerve-wracking.
Yeah, my very first podcast. Thank you.
So thank you ever so much. Wow, that was the most wonderful and amazing chat with Billy, and I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. If you haven't already, be sure to head over to follow Billy at Each Mindful Day with a full stop between each word on Instagram. You can also find all of her links in the show notes to this episode, which will be up on amypigott.co.uk. If you're local to Essex, be sure to check out Billy's in-person classes, as well as checking her out on Insight Timer. Billy's thoughts around wintering, seasonal living, and of course the importance of breathwork was so eye-opening, and it was wonderful to have her on the podcast. I know when my kids are a little older and don't need me of an evening for breastfeeding, I will definitely be going along to take some of Billy's classes. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I am so grateful for each and every one of you. I hope you leave today feeling encouraged to go out there and live your most authentic life. Don't forget to connect with me on social media. You can find me on Instagram at lifeonplot44, and you can follow along with the podcast and more at The Slow Living Collective. And I'll see you next time on the Slow Living Collective podcast.